Hello and welcome to Why We Are Christians. My name is Katie Philpott and this is my wife Katie. And we're here and we're talking by Zoom with Susan Hylen, who is in Atlanta, Georgia, I think, Susan, right?
That's right.
Okay, now we're going to be talking about your book here, Finding Phoebe. You've written a bunch of books, but tell us a little bit about who you are. I know you're a professor. You've got a PhD from someplace. Where'd you get your PhD?
I got my PhD at Emory University, which is also where I teach currently at Candler School of Theology. And
Okay.
I'm a professor of New Testament here.
You're professor of New Testament.
Yes.
Yeah,
And you're also an elder in what kind of church system?
that's right, at Oakhurst Presbyterian Church, which is a PCUSA church.
Okay,
Okay.
Presbyterian Church.
So when I was reading a review of your book in Christianity Today, review of Finding Phoebe, I had to get it. What got you going on this, Susan, that you wanted to write this book?
Well, I had previously written another book about the same topic called Women in the New Testament World. And it's a more academic book, something that I would use in the classroom with my students here at Candler. But I also wanted to write a book that regular people in churches would read, people who might never go to seminary, but are interested in this topic because a lot of people want to know more about the Bible and what it says about women. And so that's how this book came about, was trying to bring that same material and make it, approachable to a wider audience.
Well, very good. Glad you did. Glad you did because right now in I would say the evangelical community in America, it has blossomed into a real issue, hasn't it? Among some denominations.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's become a big deal.
Including one of our two. We're dually aligned with two different Baptist organizations. One is Southern Baptist. The other one is American Baptist. And they have completely different approaches to this subject.
Yeah.
Completely.
Right.
Yeah, indeed. So, so Finding Phoebe, tell us a little bit about Phoebe. And I know she's mentioned in Romans chapter 16, verses 1 and 2.
May I read that verse so that you could then respond?
That'd be great.
Okay, this is Paul speaking, and it's toward the end of the letter that he wrote to the Romans. And he's talking about the various people who have been helping him and that he wants the Roman church to be aware of and to greet, etc. He says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many and of myself as well. Now that's the English Standard Version, though I know that you're using the NIV in your book. So there you go.
That's
That's
right.
Phoebe.
Yeah. And no matter what your translation, Phoebe has this really interesting description, right? It's
Right.
more evocative than very detailed, but she's called a sister, a servant, and a patron in the ESV, right? And so I use Phoebe as a sort of entry point to think about what those words have meant to ancient readers of Romans. How might they have understood Phoebe based on their assumptions about what women in their culture did and didn't do? What would the word servant have meant to them, or what would the word patron have meant to them? And on the basis of that, can we learn anything more about what Phoebe might have been, or what we can imagine about her role within the churches?
So,
Early in the book, you spend a fair amount of time, I'll read just on wealth and property, and then social influence and status. So under wealth and property, like who owned property? Did women actually own property? People kind of don't think about that. Yes, women owned property. Maybe it was the two little coins that the putting into the coffers at the temple, or maybe it was great big amounts of wealth that landed her a statue of herself and inscriptions on on stone, etc.
So Susan, I think what you're trying to do with Phoebe is to see that that she wasn't, because she was a female, relegated to a minor role in the church.
Yeah, that's right. I think a lot of the assumptions that we have made previously about women in the ancient world have led us to believe that it would be normal for women to be relegated to a minor role in the church, right? We tend to think of women, as you were saying, Katie, as not being able to own property. Sometimes even as being almost property themselves, right? Handed from their father to their husband, sort of always with a man over them in authority. And in my research, I discovered, much to my surprise, that wasn't really true in the New Testament period. Women did own property, certainly not the same amount as men, but let's say roughly 1/3, right, of the property.
Yeah, that's what you say.
So a considerable amount, right? A regular part of normal life for women to own property. And most women were legally independent when their fathers died. So they were not under the authority of their father anymore, and they were never under the authority of their husband in the Roman system. It was only the father who had that sort of authority, and he had it over both his sons and his daughters.
Okay, explain how that also fits in with how you explain the dowry system.
Yeah, so dowries are often thought, part of this idea that women didn't own property because what they had was a dowry and that was given to the husband, right? And the husband had control over it. It's true a little bit in that most women did have a dowry when they were married, but it wasn't all of the woman's property. The woman actually had property that wasn't part of her dowry. And the dowry itself was considered the woman's property. So the husband did have the use of it during their marriage, but the idea was always that he had to give it back, either when he died or if the couple were to divorce. And that just underscores the idea that culturally it was really the woman's property from the start. So
this is different than Judaism, isn't it?
Well, I would say in this period, no. It's different from what we read in the Old Testament, right? But hundreds of years have passed since the Old Testament was written, and its laws were interpreted in Judaism. All of them were. And over that period of time, over the last 400 years before the New Testament, there's been a large Hellenistic influence, right? A large Greek influence in Palestine. So we have a lot of cultural sharing going on, and there's been a lot of change. There's not a lot of evidence that's specific to Jewish women in the first century, but what we do have suggests to me that women were not exactly the same. Jewish women weren't exactly the same as Greek women, but they were more or less the same. So we see women who own property. We see women who divorce their husbands, something that we don't think that they're able to do based on the Old Testament alone, right? And women who are owning, selling, loaning property, those kinds of transactions make it seem as if women have the same kind of capacity to manage their property as Greek or Roman women did at the time as well.
Very good.
Yeah, I want to move to 2 verses. The 1 Timothy 2 and the 1 Corinthians 14. The 2 verses that we have to come to an understanding of why it is that Paul wrote what he did. I'm going to read both of them, Susan, because I think this is where the core of the battle goes here, is on these 2 verses. So the first one, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. She is to remain quiet. And you have a similar statement by Paul in 1 Corinthians 14. So how do you, when you look at that, what are you thinking? How will you approach this?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I think if I could say one more thing that I think is helpful to know before we talk about silence,
Okay.
is the other thing that Katie mentioned about status.
Yes.
So the reason why I structure the book the way it is because first, if we understand that women had property, then we can understand that women also had social status, right? And that women weren't always subordinate to men in terms of their status, right? Some women were extremely wealthy, and they, of course, had higher social standing than men who were poorer or men who were enslaved, right? There's lots of different variables in a person's social standing. And so even, some middle class women would have had men who had lower standing than they did. For an ancient listener, the idea that women should be silent around men was a fairly normal thing to say, actually. It was sort of, just like good advice, right? How to be polite. But it did not mean to them that women were always silent in front of any man. It was interpreted according with one's social standing. So women who owned men who were enslaved by them would absolutely speak with authority to those men, right? Nobody in the culture would have questioned that or thought, oh, you can't do that because you're a woman, because they interpreted the rules of culture within that context. Like you were saying earlier, Katie, context is everything. So,
right, context is everything.
So thinking about that context and the ways that the varying social statuses of women would have affected the interpretation of a passage like this, to me, speaks a lot to the roles that we see women playing in the New Testament, because women do a lot of speaking in the New Testament, right? And they're not criticized for it, right? I think of Anna in the Gospel of Luke, right, who in the temple prophesies about Jesus' birth, or Mary also in Luke, who prophesies when she visits Elizabeth. So many women, right? We could go through listing them all, but the idea was that wasn't forbidden speech, what Anna did. It was good. Anna acknowledged God's work in Jesus, and she was right. And so, of course, that sort of community building speech by a woman, and a woman of status, right? Anna's called a prophet in that story. That would be uplifted by the community and would be something to be applauded. That really helps us see how this language about silence, it's not that it's wrong. It's not that people would have criticized it or said, oh, that doesn't matter, or it only applies in certain situations. They would have said, no, that's good general advice. But those rules of culture have to be applied in particular ways based on your standing.
Now, let me call attention to something of interest that you also have kind of in that same section that you're now talking about, which is that to be silent was good advice to men as well. It had to do, according to what your research was, it had to do with status and the general idea of self-discipline, that self-discipline meant you speak only when you have something important to say. And then you also have to add who is it that you're saying it to, and that goes for men and women.
That's right. And ancient philosophers were very concerned about this subject of self-discipline, right? They meant it in lots of different ways: anger, greed, sexual desires, right? That one should control those things. But they also thought about controlling the tongue as something that was both a philosophical good, right? It showed wisdom, it showed spiritual understanding, and it was also really hard. Something that they acknowledged. It's hard to, bite your tongue when you shouldn't be the one who speaks and somebody else should, when you have a really good idea, right? They acknowledge that. And they culturally, what they these writings show is that part of the idea is that it's not that you should always be quiet, it's that you need to know when to talk and when not to talk. And when you're with your elders or people who are your patrons or something like that, then it's your turn to be silent, regardless of if you're male or female.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, Susan, I got to get back to this. Okay. I got to get back to this. 1 Timothy 2. So, because in the evangelical community, and I'm not against this, they say the scripture is God-breathed. This is what God gave us. And when it says, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, rather she is to remain quiet. So many people are going to look at that and say, okay, we're not having any women preachers or teachers at all, and they make it a universal thing. Now, my opinion is that that may have been appropriate for that particular situation that Timothy was dealing with. This is how I look at, I'm telling you how I'm looking at 1 Timothy and the 1 Corinthians. That may have been appropriate at that particular circumstance with those people. But to make it universal, that's the problem. And that's what's going on today in some branches of Christianity.
We have an acquaintance who was part of a very large, growing Reformed church in a city nearby us. And several years ago, that church split up basically over this issue. They split up because one woman there wrote music, and lyrics to a song were sung by other people to the congregation. They considered that to be a woman teaching men, and all hell broke loose, and they split over it.
It was a great church, great ministry.
Yeah, I've never heard of that in particular, an example of music as being interpreted as teaching.
Amazing, just amazing for us to hear that people go that far with this topic.
Yes,
so
we do. We make it very much a universal, like you were saying, and I think it's in its context, it would not have been interpreted as that kind of universal. All women must be silent in front of all men, kind of thing. That would not have made sense to people of the time.
Yeah. So how do you approach? I know I'm probably pushing you a little bit over the same territory, but would you look at this passage, the 1 Timothy 2 passage, as perhaps relevant in the circumstance that Timothy was dealing with? But it can't be universal.
Yeah, that's a common approach. That in a way that people understand this, to say that there's something happening in the community to whom this letter is written, and it's specific to that community, but it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. My approach is a little bit different. It's saying this is advice that people gave in all kinds of different situations. There didn't have to be a crisis for you to say, it's good to be silent in front of your superiors, right? It was just sort of good advice. But it still wasn't universal, right? Because that advice meant silence in some circumstances was the ideal. It wasn't in every circumstance the way that we have taken it.
Yes. Okay.
Speak to the kind of the complementary thing of and Paul saying that women who pray and prophesy in church should keep their head covered, while men who pray and prophesy in church should not. Well, wait a minute. If all he's worried about is that their head should be covered, and he's not saying they shouldn't pray and prophesy at all, which is a verbal out loud thing, well, are we catching Paul in a contradiction?
Yeah, that's a great example, Katie. And I think for Paul, prophecy was the highest office, right? So we need to remember that. And when women are praying and prophesying, that's a big deal. We can't just sort of sideline that for Paul. But it's a great example because that passage is in 1 Corinthians. It's the same book as the verse that you read earlier, right, about women being silent. So within one work, we have both of these ideas, right? We have both women's silence and women's speech being valuable and important to the community. And so what I'm trying to do is to understand how within one culture, both of those things were true. We shouldn't pick between them. We shouldn't say, oh, no, it was only women's silence. That was the only thing that was important, right? We need to say, how was it possible that they said women should be silent. And at the same time, there were ways that they really valued women's speech in the community.
I'm going to want to quote a couple of statements from your book, Susan. This one's from page 159. Phoebe knew her culture's expectations about silence. She knew that a person's silence was a virtue when it showed deference to someone of higher status. She knew that silence showed self-control because it was difficult to be quiet when you had something to say.
Right, we talked that too, yeah.
So I think what you're trying to do is show the appropriate circumstances under which it was perfectly legitimate and important for the woman to speak up.
That's right. And I am imagining, Paul commends Phoebe. So by that I'm taking him to mean that she's a woman of virtue, right? She's a commendable person. So I'm imagining her as somebody who embodies these virtues and trying to understand what it would have meant for her. She goes with Paul's letter from Cenchreae or Corinth to Rome and delivers the letter there, right? So there are important leaders in that church also. How would she interact with them, right? How would she know who to be in that world? And so thinking about her as somebody who understands that virtue of when to speak and when not to speak gives me some insight to it. But I don't think it means that she would have been quiet the whole time.
That's right. Now, another quote, page 162. The culture preferred men as speakers. And we're talking about that culture. And what we do is we translate all cultures. There's so many differences, and we're hardly the same culture as what Paul was dealing with there. The culture preferred men as speakers, especially when they had a higher status than women, but the speech of women wasn't forbidden. Women's speech was especially valued when they spoke to secure the interests of their families or communities. Okay.
There are a lot of stories in the ancient world about women who spoke bravely or intervened on behalf of their communities. They're lovely stories, and it's just a reminder that that it was a good thing to speak up, right, and to say what was important for your community, to seek the good of your whole community or its safety, or to petition God or the gods. Depending on your perspective back then, to help you, right? And women were involved in all of those things, and it was always uplifted as something that was virtuous. So I think that Christ-believing women are doing these things also, and their communities also valued that speech when it happened.
I agree. I get a little troubled when I'm hearing about and encountering people who just will not tolerate a woman teaching a Bible study or in a mixed congregation on Sunday morning or whenever. Our three lady preachers at our little Miller Avenue Baptist Church are fabulous. Are fabulous. But there are those who would say, you're violating this passage in Timothy. You're violating this passage in 1 Corinthians.
Mm-hmm.
And
maybe we should say back that if you're not listening to those women, you're violating Romans 16, 1 and 2, or some of these other passages, right? Paul clearly expects women's speech. Yeah. In a lot of these stories. And certainly Phoebe, since we're talking about her as an example, would have traveled to Rome and brought this letter from Paul to the whole community there, to the men and the women, and certainly would have addressed them in some capacity at that time.
Mm-hmm. One thing I think is you've got the church in fill in the blank city name, right? Of course, in Rome, it's so big that there'll be multiple churches there. But we have so many churches here that if you go into one and your opinion is women should be silent and you see a woman in the pulpit, you're perfectly legitimate to turn on your heels and walk out. Where nobody's forcing you to accept this woman speaking in the pulpit. It was a little bit different, I think, for Timothy, where in my opinion, to some extent, is that Paul was just trying to limit the problems that Timothy would face in his congregation, because he wasn't as heavy-duty a personality, perhaps, as Paul. And if he could set some rules that would make it easier for Timothy to operate, it would go better for Timothy. Mm-hmm. Let me go to another thing that we see in the New Testament early on in Acts, when they're all gathering for Pentecost and the apostles are up in the upper room balcony and they're speaking, and everything is going fabulously well and according to the Spirit because everyone is hearing in their own language. And Peter says, this is what was uttered through the prophet Joel, quote, "And in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions, your old men dream dreams. Even on my male servants and female servants in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy."
Wow. Wow, that's a great, good old Joel, right, Susan?
That's right.
Yeah, right.
That's right. Yeah, and Luke and Acts for bringing that into the story. You know, later in Acts, there's just mentioned in passing, I think it's Philip, who has 4 daughters with the spirit of prophecy, right? So we know that women are prophets as part of that community, just as Joel prophesied, right? And that's what Luke wants people to know, is that this is coming to pass because of what Christ has done. Yeah. To raise up that important role that they had, which was really something strongly valued at the time.
My feeling is that we are on the cusp, some groups, conservative Bible-believing people, a lot of Baptists, for example, who are absolutely determined that Paul's word to Timothy and to the Corinthian church, this has to be obeyed. We cannot have women preaching, teaching. So I see the potential for the cultic mentality to spread. It's been around for a long time, but I think it's at this point it's growing, and I think this is why your book is so important, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you raised that issue. I think you're right. But I hope that by opening up more possibilities in Scripture, people can see that there's not simply a single answer to that question, what should women do? And there's a lot more room within Scripture than we might have thought previously.
Thank you, Susan, so much. We're going to have to close out, but we appreciate the time you gave to us, and we love.
Let me hold up the book again.
We love finding Phoebe.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for your ministry, and it's been really lovely to be with you both, get to know you a little bit.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Bye-bye. All right, be looking for more programs on why we are Christians. So long.